once we oversimplify and reduce things, then those who disagree with us are caricatured and demonized into just bad people.
Yep.
It's never that simple, almost ever. I think a Christian's duty is to bring healing to the world and to be the hands and feet of Christ and to bring love to our neighbor, to love our neighbor as Christ told us. And I think a big part of that is complicating the narrative, resisting those easy answers, because I think that's a big part of loving our neighbor.
It is my pleasure to welcome to the podcast Chief National Correspondent for Yahoo News and author of the phenomenal new book, Testimony, Inside the Evangelical Movement That Failed a Generation, Jon Ward. Welcome, Jon.
Thank you, Andrew. Good to see you.
It's great to see you, too. So this book taught me a lot. It did raise a lot of questions, so I'm pumped to have you here with me. So first, can you help people who might not be as familiar? How would you define evangelicals?
I mean, it's a tricky question. For a long time, evangelicals were like a hybrid. And I would say that half of the meaning of the word was cultural, political, and half the word was more like theological. And the theological half has a lot to do with a very strict, usually pretty literal reading of the Bible, and then an instinct to want to proselytize or share, for example, your testimony, but also, share your faith and convert people or get people to convert to your faith. And then the other half was cultural political. There's actually like 5 hallmarks of a classic evangelical theologically, called the Bebbington Quadrilateral, I think, if people want to look into that. And then I think over the last decade, the cultural political angle or component of the evangelical identity has really kind of overtaken the definition, much more so than the theological, the religious component. There's still a lot of people in America and quite frankly around the world who are evangelical in that classic theological sense. But certainly the way that evangelicalism has become a pretty distinct voting bloc and has kind of locked in with Trump has made it more of a political thing. I think one of the things that my book is trying to explain is that a lot of evangelicals were locked in politically with the GOP going back a couple of decades. And that's been fairly well known, but I think it became just more hard to miss over the last several years.
Yeah, so you grew up the son of a pastor yourself, one of 7 children. You grew up evangelical, as you painstakingly document, and I certainly felt for younger you. So one of the jarring elements was there was a decision where your family was like, obviously he's not going to public school, and that really took me aback. I was like, what? Obviously not going to public school. You were homeschooled for much of your childhood. What proportion of evangelicals do you think attend public school?
I think that I don't have any data on this, but if I were to guess, I would say that it's more now than it was when I was a kid. Uh-huh. I think there's been a move towards more cultural assimilation in some respects among evangelicals, cultural normalization. At the same time, there's a greater capacity over the last 10 to 20 years to stay in an information sort of bubble, as the internet has provided us more ways of, being in these silos away from each other. Not just evangelicals. Everybody, has that temptation to stay in their silo. But back in the 70s and 80s when I was growing up, the movie The Village by M. Night Shyamalan kind of describes the mentality that my parents' generation and some number of evangelicals had about trying to keep their kids out of too much contact with people who were not just Christians, but who were not the kind of Christians we were.
Yeah, so you were homeschooled. And my wife and I joke about homeschooling our two kids and just conclude it would be way too much work. You're a parent yourself, so you probably can relate to aspects of that.
Well, we all had homeschooling during COVID, right? I mean, that was all
Yeah,
a
yeah,
lot. Yeah.
yeah. We all got an education ourselves. So you were under a lot of pressure, I suppose, as a pastor's kid. You had one story where your dad was like, "Hey, like be more active in service," and you're like, "Oh, Dad, you're just trying to make yourself look good." And he was like, "Yeah, that's right." And I was like, "Well, that actually is pretty, pretty ballsy on your part as a kid, and then pretty high character of him."
Yeah.
I think some of the most personal stuff, and I commend you for it because I think it is kind of vital to understanding. So you talk about how the culture doesn't necessarily lend itself to a lot of intellectual exploration or relationship exploration, where you were kind of confessing about a number of times a week you masturbated to a group of other people in a Starbucks, and you were like, "Why the hell are we doing this in a Starbucks?" Uh, and I thought that both of these strains were extraordinarily powerful in terms of explaining how the culture is formed.
One of the interesting moments about that Starbucks cringe moment, scene is that I was asking myself, why are we doing this in a Starbucks? As I wrote that part, I tried to think back to whether I questioned why we were doing it at all. And it's an interesting, juxtaposition there to me that I was questioning some component of it, but I'm not sure that I really questioned the overall thrust of what we were doing. And so
You're like, this could be better situated.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I was highly uncomfortable, but at the same time, I describe how, I would be one of the first people to kind of jump into participation because I was so committed to it at the time. One of the ways that I am probably most unevangelical at this point goes to the issue you just raised about intellectual exploration, intellectual openness. I still, consider myself a Christian and consider my faith to be very important to me and incredibly powerful. But I think a big difference between the way I was raised and the way I am now is that I just hold pretty much most of my beliefs with a much more open hand because I don't live in a very small closed system or culture where a high degree of my belonging depends on how fervently I express adherence to these views. And once you get, I think, out of that kind of a social setting, you have more independence to kind of work through intellectually, the fact that we just can't know for sure the answers to any of this, which is why we call it faith. And it's why we can't be certain about matters of faith. At least in my view, I don't think it's very healthy to do it that way. And then I also write about the fact that over the last several years, people who are certain about things that we can't know for sure became relativists about things that we did know, such as, public health measures to try to mitigate the spread of COVID or who won the 2020 election. It wasn't necessarily that I was encountering people all the time who were saying, evangelicals who were saying, I know that, Trump won. It was actually something even more puzzling and infuriating at times, which was, well, they'd kind of trot out a few conspiracy theories or things that they heard on the internet or read on the internet. I would present them with, evidence to the contrary, and then they would kind of throw up their hands and say, well, we can't really know for sure. And it just was like this very bizarre upside down.
Well, I think one of the most important elements of your book is helping people understand how the evangelical community regards the establishment media, institutions, where you're growing up in a culture that feels like it's in a parallel track and in opposition. And there's also a sense that these institutions and the media look down their nose at you. I mean, you have a story about your being on MSNBC and quoting scripture, and them just like, what the heck? And you were like, I don't think that took. Now you're this fascinating figure where you're now straddling the national journalism world, which I'm going to suggest is very, very secularized, and this evangelical upbringing. And I think one of the most important things for people to understand is, look, like a lot of these people are raised in in an environment where they feel like they are in opposition to these institutions and these media messages. And so this relationship with information that you're describing, where you present to evangelicals, hey, here's some evidence on, let's say, COVID or whatnot, I think one of the most powerful forces that Trump has tapped into is this anti-institutional sentiment.
Yeah, 100%. I use the analogy that for a long time, the relationship between people in the world I grew up in, evangelicals, their relationship with, the news media in general and institutions, non-religious institutions mostly, their relationship to that world was very strained. If I think I used the metaphor of a tree, where the branch or the connective tissue between evangelicals and secular media or secular institutions was hanging by a thread, and Trump came along and really snapped it in half, and then kind of brought a lot of people with him into an alternative epistemic universe. And I think that issue of epistemology, how do we know what we know, is at the root of so many of the issues driving our cultural, political dysfunction today.
Yeah, especially now.
It's why I think Jonathan Rauch's book, The Constitution of Knowledge, is so important. And it's a start. Jonathan's book is a starting point because it's dense. It needs a lot more like bringing out of the lessons he talks about into real world applications. But if we can't kind of establish a baseline of how we produce knowledge that everyone can kind of share as a starting point for disagreement and debate, and also a system for resolving those disagreements without violence, then we're going to continue to see, I think, a lot of the dysfunction that we're talking about or that we're seeing. And I think, you pointed to it, there is this parallel universe that I grew up in, which in some ways was motivated by a sense that we know better than people who are not like us or don't believe like us. But it also creates that sense of opposition, that sense of we're going to be persecuted, they're out to get us. And so all of that is what was going on for a very long time before Trump ever came along, which was a big part of the mix. And I'm really glad that you are perceiving the ways I think that the book lays out how the ground was seeded for a long time.
This podcast is sponsored by ExpressVPN. In a tough economy, you're looking for ways to save money, and you know a sneaky way you can do it? ExpressVPN. Now, you're asking yourself, how is that possible? Doesn't ExpressVPN cost money? It does cost less than $7 a month, but it can help you unlock content that will save you money for days and days. What do I mean? For example, let's say I'm a Duran Duran fan, which I am. I want to watch the concert movie of Duran Duran, but it is not available on Netflix in the US. However, with ExpressVPN, I can just beam myself into the UK, click on Netflix, and voila. Duran Duran and a bunch of other content I could not have gotten any other way. It's a no-brainer. If you want to preserve your own data from the big tech companies and get more content and save money while you're at it, go to expressvpn.com/yang. Don't forget to use my link so you can get 3 extra months free. That's expressvpn.com/yang. expressvpn.com/yang to learn more. So one of the things I was thinking when I was reading the first part of your book, which was about your upbringing and all these experiences, I was like, how the heck does this dude become a national reporter? So you are, so you intern at a paper in D.C., the Washington Times. They ask you if you want to cover local news or sports. You were a sports nut. How close did you come to just saying sports?
Close, but I also felt like if I covered sports, then I would lose my love of sports because it would just become
Smart.
a job. So, and I also, my other calculation at that time was it would be much easier to go from news to sports if I didn't like news than it would be to go from sports to news because I just felt like the skills or the whatever was not as transferable from sports to news as it was the other way around, which I think was generally correct.
Nice job, young you. So you get promoted, you become a reporter, wind up climbing the ranks. You work for the Huffington Post for a particular period. You worked for the Daily Caller. I think that I had that out of order. It might have been Daily Caller than Huffington Post.
Yeah,
and then,
it was Tucker and then Ariana, right?
yeah. So I mean, talk about the polls. I mean, like most people think, that there's not much in common there. There's a quote from you that I love so much. Which I think talks about your desire to learn and intellectually explore. First and foremost, truth seekers don't search for battles outside themselves to win. Instead, they examine their own point of view, searching for holes, weaknesses, errors. And you referred earlier to the fact that those in your community feel like you know better, you know things other people don't. And then there was a desire to proselytize, to expand the faith. And that approach seems to run counter to the quote that I just read, in the sense that, hey, I'm not really examining my own point of view, like I'm spreading a point of view I'm certain about to others.
Yeah, and I also write about how I still have that instinct kind of deep in my bones, and I've got to check myself to not take that same instinct with a new perspective and continue to act as if I know better than other people, or other people need to think like I do, because that kind of instinct can be hard to get rid of if it's the way you've been raised. I think I'm doing better, and it's interesting I don't think before I wrote this book I would have traced that approach to knowledge and truth back to its source the way that you do when you kind of explore your own story and write about it and think about it, which I encourage everybody to do in some form. I think it's a really healthy process to do every 10, 20 years even.
What's that? Another book in the next 10 to 20 years? I'm kidding. No, I totally agree with you, Jon, where you actually learn a lot by putting pen to paper and your thoughts down, especially if you wind up including your own experiences, because you don't think about your own childhood every day.
And I wouldn't have, it wasn't until I did this process that I was able to come to a pretty strong conclusion that my approach to truth owes a lot of its roots back to my dad and the way that he taught us about faith. Even if he and I disagree about a lot of things religiously and politically today. And he's a pretty big character in the book, but he taught me a certain way. And he taught me from certain books of the Bible, which I think shaped a lot of my approach to this.
So you wind up the chief national correspondent for Yahoo. You've covered several presidents at this point. You've ridden in Air Force One. You've tracked various presidential campaigns. What proportion of big shot journalists like yourself are of an evangelical background?
Yeah, I mean, in DC, there are pockets of people who kind of connect with one another, and then you realize you have similar backgrounds or similar faiths. I think the thing that's notable to me in thinking about this question, not just when you asked it, but a bunch of people have kind of brought this up, is that I think we just don't do a very good job of creating space for people to talk about this. Because I think there's more people than we realize who have maybe not the same faith background, but take faith very seriously. And there's just not a lot of conversation about it because it is, I think it has come to be seen as something that is more of a private matter than as something that is like something to be talked about in public company. And it was healthy for me to go through the process of writing this because it has given me the ability and the language to talk about things, and just the practice to talk about these matters in ways that are, I think, maybe make people, they're more translatable, more accessible to people. But in terms of like a percentage of people who are in the press who have my background, it's probably not a lot.
That was one of the things I thought to myself. I was like, I feel like Jon might be something of a unicorn.
I mean, I think one of the realities here is that I think to get anywhere in life, it doesn't, it probably doesn't help to be in a position where your family and your immediate sort of social network is not just not focused on financial and educational achievement, but is kind of actively pushing away from that. And so I did start from behind in a lot of ways. And I think that's one of the reasons why people from these types of backgrounds have a hard time making it.
There's also this massive skepticism of these institutions that,
Right.
baked into a lot of your family members. And I loved your conversations because we all heard about, some of us experienced the internecine family strife over Trump. And you even document the conversations you had with your family. There's one story you had that was so painful to me, which was, but honest. There's a lot of your book where you're like, whoa, kudos for sharing that. So you go back and visit your family and they've got Trump Pence signs up and you're just like, I can't, I don't want to have these signs up while I'm having dinner. And so you take the signs and put one in the bushes, put another one in maybe a part of the garage that it wasn't in, and then you have dinner, then you leave, and then your family's like, "Hey, what happened to the signs?" And you're like, "Oh yeah, I threw it in the bushes." And then they're livid. They're freaking furious at you for doing that. You detail various exchanges you had where you have long messages where you're trying to persuade your family members of this. And I thought that their responses to you were so telling because their responses spoke for not just them, but, millions of other Americans who were responding the same way.
Yeah, I thought it was important to include the ways that I screwed up and the ways that I went too far and got too angry or too hot over the last few years. I mean, when I went to my parents' house that night when they had the signs in the yard, I had been spending months sort of reporting very closely on how people could vote during the pandemic. And I had been doing months of work on exploring what was true and what was false about, the issue of voter fraud and voter suppression and all these things around voting. So, and we were right before I got to my parents' house, like the week or two before that, it was becoming clearer how Republicans in state legislatures were going to delay the counting of the votes to give space for Trump to claim that the election was stolen. This was 2 months before the election. And so it was very clear to me that Trump was waging a very open kind of assault on reality and on democracy at that point. And I regret, doing what I did, but I thought it was important to be in there.
Hey YouTube, glad you're enjoying the podcast. If you really like it, hit subscribe, and then YouTube will notify you every time we have a bang up new guest. Thank you. Yeah, and so there's some quotes from you and from your family that I kind of wanted to share because I thought they were so telling. Some in my family also exhibited a desire to blow up everything in our government and politics out of some nebulous mix of fear and rage. And this is something a lot of Americans know is going on, but because you're close to it, you speak about it personally, and these are your relatives. The fear came from a sense that the left wanted to police their beliefs, their language, even their thoughts. They were also outraged by the sense that discussing systemic racism was a way to label all white people as racist. This combination of factors produced a nihilism that shocked me. One sibling told me he wanted to burn it all down and see what emerged from the ruins. Another relative told me that if Trump turned out to be an authoritarian, Americans could turn him out of office with a coup. I looked at his face closely to see if he was joking, and he was serious. So these were sentiments that you had direct conversations with family members about, and that there are a lot of Americans who feel the same way.
Yeah, and this was the 2016 time period, and there were just a lot of things being surfaced that I think myself and many other people just thought were beyond the realm of the thinkable. But it's that old idea of the Overton window, the art or the realm of what's possible. It just began to just like shift in a major way. And so, yeah, I was having these conversations and just kind of stunned at what I was hearing. It again taps into that oppositional mindset that goes a long ways back, which, I write in the book or I cite a book on evangelicalism written by a historian named Frances Fitzgerald. She's one of many historians who have documented how this anti-institutionalism goes back to, hundreds of years ago, because evangelicalism grew out of a class-based, dispute in the American frontier over religion. But I think it's a whole other thing, which is what I'm kind of getting from your response to the book, to see somebody living today who's in a mainstream media job, who grew up in this world, who's telling stories from the front lines of that world. And that oppositional mindset just thinks like, they're out to get us, and we're already kind of keeping to ourselves, so we don't have a lot of one-on-one or real-world contact with them, the people who are out to get us. So our fears can kind of just continue to escalate and keep going. And there are people out there making money off of exacerbating those fears and playing
Sure.
into those fears. And so I don't dismiss, and I've said this elsewhere, I don't dismiss the fact that, like, if you're a very conservative religious person and you have very conservative views on social issues, a lot, especially around sexuality, I don't dispute that there are people, on the other side who are saying things or doing things that raise concerns about religious liberty or your right to have that opinion or your right to say that opinion. I do think those fears are sometimes exaggerated, but I also acknowledge they exist, and there are reasons for them. My perspective as a person of faith is that faith gives us a lot of things, including courage to advocate for our point of view, but then not try to run roughshod over the rights or whatever of other people in our attempt to get what we want.
Well, I think that's the key to this. Where I had a conversation with someone of faith the other day, and he said, "Look, I believe certain things. You may believe something else. The problem I have is that I'm being painted as immoral or a bad person for holding the beliefs that I believe."
Right.
And I think that's the fundamental problem, where we're a very diverse country on multiple levels, and we shouldn't imagine that other people are going to believe the same thing we believe, but we should still respect them and accept them. And they may be living a different life than we are, but we may even want to engage in a conversation with them and say, "Hey, like, why do you feel this way? Like, I feel this way, and maybe I can persuade you to a certain point of view." The problem arises when the message is like, you're a bad person, you're lesser, you're maybe even less than human because you believe a certain thing or live a certain way.
Yeah, and there's also often this assumption that, and this actually can go different directions, but there's an assumption that I've come to the right conclusion and everybody around me thinks the same thing. And so people who think differently, like, just need to get with the program. And if they don't, then, there's something wrong with them. I think one of the things that my book is trying to convey is that it takes a long time for anyone to evolve and change and for their perspective to grow. I do think my perspective has evolved in a positive direction. People from where I come from probably disagree, The point is that all of this stuff takes a long time. And so I think patience with one another is really important, even if we vehemently disagree. Now, there are, views that, we have a lot of freedom in this country to say and believe things that are offensive to one another. And, the law on the First Amendment does limit our speech on certain things, but it's only at a very high tipping point of incitement to violence and a couple other situations. And so I think extending that into our personal interactions is healthy.
So much of this problem is social media. You and I both grew up in the 70s, and there were people probably, a few doors down who had beliefs that I might have found offensive, but they just talk about it with their friends in the garage, and we don't have to have an argument about it.
Right.
I think that's where so much of it is amplified nowadays. If you imagine a world where social media went away, then all of a sudden it's like we're in a very different environment. And you and I have bridged that world. Now you have kids of your own who are probably a little bit too young for social media. Mine happily I think are as well. But I do live in some degree of trepidation and anxiety about the world they're inheriting as a result of the fact that I think there are real pressures to say certain things and believe certain things, and if you don't, then you'll be cast out of the group. And unfortunately now we're so polarized that there are these two dominant narratives or groups that you fear being cast out of.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts. And first of all, our oldest is 15, so...
then they're at the cusp, man. So I didn't realize your kids were at that. Kids are a little older than mine.
We've held the line as much as possible and really limited their use of social media, and I'm really glad that we have. Going back to what we were just talking about, though, if we don't give other people patience, I think people will just stop trying to understand the other point of view or evolve or grow. If it becomes zero sum and we don't give each other room and space to kind of think things or say things that we disagree with, everybody just kind of retreats to their corners. It actually reduces the amount of progress, I think, that we make.
Oh yeah, for sure. There has to be this sense of shared humanity and fellowship. You have to be able to come to the table, and you've done this because you've had the experiences you've had. You sit down at the table with someone who might be from another way of life, and you expect one thing, and then after 10 minutes, you're like, oh, this person's actually fine. How many times have you had that experience? I've had it thousands of times now.
I can't imagine how many times you've had it running for office. I mean, I've had lots of conversations in my professional capacity with people who are different, who I get to ask questions from and just listen to them, which is really quite a gift to not have any pressure, any ego pressure, any social pressure to do anything other than just sit and listen and ask questions. It's life-changing. And I can't imagine how many times running for office you've had exponentially probably more conversations. And I think both of us, are lucky in that respect, because a lot of people, they have to make more of an effort to be in similar situations where they can seek out those kinds of conversations. I don't think it's really the norm for people to have an easy access to that.
This podcast is sponsored by Helix Sleep. What the heck is Helix Sleep? It is the mattress of the future company. I have always been someone who valued my sleep. Figured, you're going to do it for 7, maybe even 8 hours. You wake up feeling refreshed and energized. What is that worth? Helix Sleep can help make that happen. Just take their sleep quiz and figure out what personalized mattress should be shipped straight to your door, and you have 100 days to return it. I don't recommend returning it after 99 days, but hey, who am I to say? Don't take my word for it. It's the #1 rated mattress from GQ and Wired. Can you imagine being the mattress tester? It's a job. Someone has it. Helix is offering 20% off all mattress orders and 2 free pillows for our listeners right now. Go to helixsleep.com/yang. This is their best offer yet, and it won't last long. With Helix, better sleep starts now. So you had a quote early in the book that I was like, well, that's the most interesting term I've seen in quite some time. It was a border stalker. There was the sense that you have these tribes who are, defined in a certain way. And you talk about a lot of the youthful experiences you had was like, hey, we're all going to do this. We're all going to sing this or feel a certain way. And then yet you present this idea from a thinker that then there are these people that are border stalkers. And how would what does it mean to be a border stalker?
Comes from a book called Culture Care by Mako Fujimura, who's a painter and an author. And I just love that term because it contravenes the idea of culture war.
Yeah.
And Mako talks about how, culture is not a territory to be won. It's a garden to be cared for.
Wow. We should put that out far and wide, man. Say that again. Like, culture is not a territory to be won. Is it a resource to be tended?
Yeah, I mean, something along those lines. I actually just kind of threw in the garden to be cared for, but it's something, I don't remember the exact language he uses, but it's something to that effect. And he definitely says it's not a territory to be won. And, a border stalker, he got it from Beowulf, and it's a term in Old English, I think, that he said is Mirkstapa, which is an even weirder word and kind of interesting. I resonated with that because growing up, I didn't feel completely at home in church, even though I tried to belong. I think, again, going back maybe to my dad and some mix of DNA, like I just couldn't stop asking sort of questions about, why do we do this? Why do we think that? But I tried to belong. And so I was sort of...
And they were elevating you to leadership positions, man. They had you on stage speaking at a young age.
Yeah. That was in like my college years. Again, though, I kind of couldn't be enough of a yes man, even though I think I tried. And yet I'm not really at home in secular or mainstream media as well. And I always kind of set out to kind of keep myself at arm's length from both like the TV establishment and like the cocktail party establishment, just out of like almost instinct. And so a border stalker is somebody who actually, I think it's somewhat constitutional. I think it's not a role for everybody, but I think closed groups and societies need to recognize their need for these types of people who move between groups and tribes and both ask uncomfortable questions inside those groups, but also try to bring understanding between different groups.
Yeah, I think this idea of being a border stalker is incredibly important. And I joked once when someone asked, like, hey, why should you be president? And I thought to myself, well, the real answer is that I just don't socialize very easily. that if you put me in a group and the group's like, hey, we should do this, I'm just like, should we? I might have said that to like my staff at one point. They didn't understand it. I guess I could have said I'm a border stalker, and they also wouldn't have understood that. But I think this idea that there's this collective or a tribe, and then you're not like, in the front of it or in the middle of it. I mean, you said like, hey, look, I tried, and you're, obviously a person of faith, and they were trying to elevate you in certain ways, and you were the group leader. But you naturally wound up trying to test the borders of what you believe. You wanted to absorb new pieces of information. And your book closes on what I think is the most powerful, important message I've seen in quite some time, which is Christians can and should become agents of nuance rather than of reductionism. And I was like, wow, is that powerful? This means embracing complexity and rejecting easy explanations.
There's a journalist named Amanda Ripley who wrote a book called High Conflict. I hope I'm getting that right. I think that's correct. And I think the book came out of an essay she wrote called Complicating the Narrative. We live in a time where there is so much information, there's so much entertainment, there's so much stress and busyness. And so we're all dealing with a need to simplify. And so that is the pressure that adds on top of the natural human instinct to reduce things to, understandable terms, understandable concepts. So I understand the instinct to reduce and simplify. But when it comes to issues of disagreement, especially, we have to resist that instinct, because once we oversimplify and reduce things, then those who disagree with us are caricatured and demonized into just bad people.
Yep.
It's never that simple, almost ever. I mean, I want to say never, but there probably are some situations where, the person we disagree with or the bad person really is just mostly bad. But most of the time, like, people are coming from their point of view and they think they have good motives and good reasons for what they're doing. And I think a Christian's duty is to bring healing to the world and to be the hands and feet of Christ, and to bring love to our neighbor, to love our neighbor as Christ told us. And I think a big part of that is complicating the narrative, resisting those easy answers, because I think that's a big part of loving our neighbor.
Yeah, again, it's a beautiful message. You summarize it in this way. It said, to love God, to love those around you, and to lift up the downtrodden. It doesn't seem like it should have to be too much more complicated than that. And I was like, well, that seems like a very pure message. You do at one point reference that there are other religious communities, and one of the things that this made me think of was my visit to the King Center in Atlanta, where obviously and I went to the Ebenezer Baptist Church, and the message there was anti-racism, anti-poverty, anti-war. And these messages strike me as very universal and deeply Christian.
Yeah, I don't know how to talk to people from. I probably shouldn't even say this, but I don't know how to talk to people from sort of conservative religious circles about the whole issue of how you view other faiths, because for me, it's not, I don't feel conflicted about it, but I know if you have very conservative religious views, especially if you believe in hell, there are millions of people, probably hundreds of millions of people around the world who believe that if you believe the wrong thing, you're punished forever. I don't know what the numbers are. There's a lot of people who believe that.
Yes.
And that's a whole nother big ingredient in everything we're talking about, because it also reduces some things to a very zero-sum issue. If I don't convince you to think like me, you're going to suffer for all of eternity. I mean, you can understand if you really believe that it pushes you to make some pretty radical, extreme decisions in how you interact with people, how you engage in public life and in politics. So I'm not even sure why I went off on that, other than to say I agree with you that those principles from the King Center are really compelling. And I've come to a place where I believe in Christianity and I hold it dearly, and it motivates me and it empowers my life. But I'm much more interested in how I'm living my life and in how others are living their lives for those simple baseline values of loving God and loving creation and loving our neighbor and helping those who need it, rather than being absolutely pure on how I think about this religious doctrine or that one.
Yeah, I mean, you could lead with love thy neighbor, and it would solve a lot. And maybe your neighbor might even be of the other party. I mean, one of the things about polarization nowadays is that politics have replaced religion in terms of
Yeah.
what you're concerned about your child dating or marrying. It's like I'd be much more accepting of them marrying someone of a different faith as long as they're of the same political persuasion. And that is new. It used to be very much the other way around.
I think a big part of the reason for that is because religion became increasingly irrelevant to everyday life. If there's no real connection between what you're hearing in church or, reading in the Bible or your other sacred text, let's just say the Bible for now, because I don't want to talk about religious traditions I'm not qualified to comment
Yeah,
on.
sure.
But if there's not a lot of relevance between those things and the issues of everyday life that are really pressing and important, then you are going to look somewhere else for a framework for how to engage that. And that's one of I think the big ideas in my book is that the evangelical church has pretty objectively failed to train people in how not just to be a good person in their private lives and their families and in their churches and in their workplaces, but how to be a good Christian for the common good and for your neighbor in all of life, including politics. I would call that public character, and I don't think that the evangelical church, largely the white conservative evangelical church, has really put a whole lot of work into that, whereas I think other streams of Christianity have. I think Catholics have done a lot of work on this. I think the Black church has done a lot of work on this.
Yeah, you talk about how evangelicals rejected Clinton because of his sexual misconduct, and then when Trump came along, it's like, well, like let's ignore it. And then and there was like an aspect of that where you're like, that doesn't seem terribly consistent.
It was inconsistent, but to me, I think that was never the most compelling criticism. To me, the lack of training and discernment in the evangelical church meant that people weren't even able to think outside of the regular Democrat-Republican paradigm, because if they were able to do that, they could have seen the way that Trump kind of stood outside of either party and was really running against democracy. And he was running against a free press. He criticized Democrats and Hillary Clinton, but the criticisms that I waged and others waged of Trump and still do are not partisan or ideological.
Well, he was running against a set of institutions, and because many evangelicals felt like in opposition to those institutions, he became their guy.
Yeah.
And that relationship, I mean, it's going to be tested again now. It seems very hard for any of the other candidates to break in there, especially because Trump does have some concrete victories that he can point to. Your closing message, I think, is awesome, and it's something that I hope Forward Party actually can be a part of. Politically, a credible Christian presence would be prophetic. It would not be captive to any one political party. Imagine that. It would be free to praise both Democrats and Republicans and free to critique them both as well. To the degree it would be a voting bloc, it would represent a group of voters who could not be won over with appeals to tribal identity or by fear-based appeals that demonize minority groups to the other side. This voting bloc would support politicians who demonstrate a devotion to solid principles. These voters would reward politicians who put the good of the whole country or state or county or town ahead of their own careers, who risk losing their political post in order to preserve the stability of the political system for future generations. I mean, what a beautiful vision that is.
It's a politics of love rather than of fear or opposition or hate. It's a politics of love of country. And love of what this country has stood for, which is imperfectly creating and maintaining a system in which we can continue to strive towards, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of conscience, equality, even though obviously we have not done that anywhere close to perfectly. I talk in the book about my own realization of the depths of, racism and structural inequality in the book. And a lot of times that's called now just like wokeism, like any acknowledgement of that is just wokeism and it's a cancer and all that. And I love this country more than ever as a result of studying its history. And I think this country has done immense good. It's also done a lot of bad, but I love it. And I think that there are not a lot of other great options in human history for what we've accomplished in this country, as much as it has been highly imperfect and often, quite dark. And so the politics you're describing there is
what
one
you're describing.
yeah. The one that we're both kind of, I think, in search of is one that is motivated by a love of that, rather than, what we hate. I mean, what's the term? Negative polarization. That's the term I think the political scientists use. That is what is motivating increasingly large numbers of political decisions is who do I hate more?
Yep.
We gotta break out of that.
Or who do I hate less? Really, very, very, very often.
Correct. Yeah.
I'm the son of immigrants. I love this country dearly as well, despite all of its imperfections and flaws. What we could really use is a political movement that puts that love of your neighbor and love of country above defeating the other side. Maybe there isn't another side. You know what I mean? Like maybe that's not the way you see the world. that it's like me against you. Instead, it's like wait, like you're probably more like me than I realized.
Yeah, that's that scarcity mindset that thinks that everything is a zero-sum game. But yeah, I couldn't agree more with you on that.
Well, Jon, congratulations on a phenomenal achievement and contribution, testimony inside the evangelical movement that failed a generation. So if people want to keep up with you and your reporting, how can they best do so?
I have a website that has information on the book with also links to where I write on Substack. And the website is jonwardwrites.org, JONWARD Writes, WRITES.org. And on my Twitter, JONWARD11, you can also find a link to my stuff that I'm writing for Yahoo News. Those would be the top places to go.
So grateful that you've put your story out there in such a powerful and compelling way. And I hope that Americans read and take heed. Appreciate the work you do a great deal.
Thank you, Andrew. It's good to see you again. I think the last time I saw you was following you around Manhattan, and I enjoyed that very much. I've enjoyed watching your political entrepreneurship. I think it's been fascinating and inspiring. So thank you for having me on.
Oh, thanks, man. Good times. Come back anytime.